Imagine waking up, checking your bank account, and realizing it's gone. Not just a little gone, all of it. Your savings, your rent money, even that 20 bucks you were saving for pizza. Poof. Now imagine that same thing happening to millions of people at the same time. That was the Great Depression. One day, America was throwing money around like Oprah. You get a dollar, everybody gets a dollar. And the next day, the music stopped. The banks were broke, and suddenly everyone was standing in line for bread. So how did the biggest economic disaster in modern history actually happen? To find out, we've got to rewind to the 1920s. They called it the Roaring Twenties, and honestly, the name fits. People were making money, spending money, and showing off money like it was their full-time job. Jazz clubs were packed, dance halls were buzzing, and if you weren't bragging about your stock portfolio, you were considered dull. Imagine if every small talk conversation today started with, "Hey, did you buy Tesla or Bitcoin this week?" That was the vibe. The stock market was the star of the show. To most people, it looked like a magical machine where you could put in a dollar and somehow get two back. Even people who'd never touched a stock before were jumping in. A shoe shiner might give you advice on buying steel company shares, and your grandma might casually brag about her returns. But there was one big catch. Most people weren't even using their own money. Instead, they were borrowing it. This was called buying on margin, which is just a fancy way of saying, I don't actually have this money, but I'll pretend I do. Imagine having $100, borrowing $900 more, and throwing the full $1,000 into stocks because your neighbor swore this company was guaranteed to win. That was completely normal back then, and as long as prices went up, everybody looked like a genius. But the whole system was like building a Jenga tower on a wobbly table. It looked tall, impressive, unstoppable, until somebody nudged it, and then the whole thing would crash. And that's exactly what happened. The warning signs were there, but people ignored them. Farmers had been struggling for years. During World War I, they grew massive amounts of food to feed soldiers overseas. But after the war, demand collapsed. Suddenly, wheat and corn prices tanked, and farmers were drowning in debt. Imagine planting enough food for an army, then finding out nobody wants it and you can't even pay your bills. That was life for farmers. Banks were also shaky. Unlike today, there was no FDIC insurance. If your bank went under, your money was gone. Imagine Venmo deleting your account one morning and saying, "Sorry, dude, nothing we can do." That's what it was like. Meanwhile, the rich were living like they were in a Jay Gatsby novel. Fancy cars, caviar for breakfast, champagne for dinner, while most workers were just hoping they could afford meat once in a while. The wealth gap was massive, but instead of slowing down, people just kept partying. It was like speeding toward a cliff while blasting music so loud you couldn't hear the GPS screaming, "Turn back now!" Then came October 1929. On October 24th, known as Black Thursday, stock prices began to fall. People panicked, rushed to sell, and prices dropped faster. The chaos snowballed. By October 29th, Black Tuesday, the market collapsed completely. Wall Street was a madhouse. Traders were screaming, papers were flying, and everyone was trying to dump stocks worth less than a soggy sandwich. Billions of dollars vanished in a matter of days. People went to bed rich and woke up broke. Imagine checking your Robinhood account and seeing it go from $50,000 to $5 overnight. That's how it felt. And remember all those folks who bought with borrowed money? They still owed the banks, even though their stocks were now worthless. It was like maxing out your credit card to buy crypto and then watching it crash 99% overnight. You're broke, but you still owe the bill. This brings us to the banks. As panic spread, people rushed to pull out their savings. But the banks didn't actually have the money. They had lent it out to the very gamblers who just lost everything. This caused bank runs, with crowds of desperate people lining up outside to withdraw cash. Imagine your entire town showing up at the same ATM, only to find out the machine is empty. Between 1930 and 1933, nearly 9,000 banks failed. If your bank collapsed, so did your life savings. No refunds, no backup, no second chances. With banks failing and people broke, businesses were next. Nobody was buying, so companies shut down. Factories closed, workers were laid off, and unemployment skyrocketed. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Think about that. If you and 3 friends grabbed lunch, chances are one of you couldn't even afford the sandwich. And even if you kept your job, your paycheck was probably cut to the bone. Families that once dreamed of cars and radios were now just hoping to afford potatoes for dinner. The Depression didn't just stop at America's borders, it went global. After World War I, the U.S. had been lending money to Europe and buying their goods. When America collapsed, so did everyone else. Countries tried to protect themselves by raising tariffs, basically slapping extra taxes on imports. But instead of helping, it just made things worse. World trade shrank, economies shriveled, and the Depression spread worldwide. It was like everyone was stuck in quicksand, and instead of pulling each other out, they pushed each other down. For ordinary families, life became a daily struggle. Millions lost their homes and moved into makeshift camps of shacks built from scrap wood and metal. These were nicknamed Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, who everyone blamed for not fixing things. In big cities, people stood in breadlines that stretched for blocks, waiting hours just for a little food. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, farmers sometimes destroyed crops or poured out milk because prices were so low it wasn't even worth selling them. Imagine burning your own food while kids in the city went hungry. That's how twisted the economy had become. Children dropped out of school to help their families survive. Teenagers became hobos, hopping on trains across the country in search of work. It sounds adventurous when you hear it now, but in reality, it was cold nights, empty stomachs, and endless rejection. Shoes were patched with cardboard, clothes were worn until they were rags, and dinner often meant scraps or soup stretched so thin it was more water than anything else. And then, just when things couldn't possibly get worse, nature stepped in to say, "Hold my beer." In the early 1930s, a massive drought hit the Great Plains. Crops withered, the soil dried up, and then came the winds. Dust storms rolled across farms, swallowing everything in clouds of dirt. People called it the Dust Bowl. Imagine trying to cook dinner and your stew comes with a side of sand. Families had no choice but to pack up and leave. They headed west, especially to California, hoping for jobs. These migrants, often nicknamed Okies, thought they were escaping misery, but when they got there, jobs were scarce, pay was low, and locals weren't exactly thrilled to welcome thousands of desperate newcomers. Imagine driving across the country broke, covered in dust, only to hear, "Sorry, no work here either." That was reality. Meanwhile, the government looked helpless. President Hoover believed the economy would fix itself. Spoiler, it didn't. He started a few programs, but they were too little, too late. People grew angry, and Hoover's name became shorthand for failure. Shantytowns weren't just called Hoovervilles as a joke, they were an insult. By 1933, voters had had enough. That year, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, promising a New Deal. And unlike Hoover, FDR came ready to shake things up. The New Deal created jobs through massive public projects, building bridges, roads, dams, and schools. It gave farmers financial support, reformed banks so people's savings were safer, and set up safety nets for struggling families. The Depression didn't magically vanish overnight, but for the first time in years, people felt hope, and hope mattered. Still, the road out was long. Throughout the 1930s, unemployment stayed high and families continued to struggle. The Depression dragged on, stubborn and brutal. What finally ended, it wasn't government programs at all. It was World War II. When the U.S. entered the war in 1941, factories roared back to life, producing weapons, tanks, ships, and planes. Millions of men went into the military, and millions of women filled their places in the workforce. Suddenly, unemployment dropped to almost zero. War is tragic, but in this case, it succeeded in boosting the economy in a way nothing else had. By the end of the war, America came out stronger than ever. So, what caused the Great Depression? A perfect storm of risky behavior, bad luck, and a fragile system built like a house of cards. People borrowed too much to gamble in the stock market. Banks weren't safe. Farmers and workers were already struggling. The crash of 1929 set off a chain reaction that toppled banks, businesses, and jobs. Then, a drought and dust storms made it worse. The New Deal helped, but it took a global war to finally snap America out of it. The Great Depression was one giant reminder that when everyone thinks the good times will last forever, that's usually the moment they don't. Or, in today's language, don't max out your credit card to buy crypto just because your buddy swears it's going to the moon. If you like videos like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.